You pull up to a pond you've never fished, open a depth app on your phone, and start working the areas that look deepest on screen. 2 hours in, you've caught nothing, and you're starting to wonder if the app got it wrong or the pond is simply empty. A generation ago, an old bank fisherman could walk up to that same pond, never having seen it before, and find the deep water within his first few steps. No app, no map, no history with that specific water. He wasn't guessing. He already knew before a single cast because of what was growing at his feet. Here is the mechanism itself, right away. Most aquatic plants can only survive within a fairly narrow range of depth, light penetration, and bottom type, which means what's growing along a bank is rarely randomly scattered. It grows in distinct bands, one depth range at a time, moving out from the shore into deeper water. Think of it as a staircase of bands leading down into the pond, each one marking roughly where the bottom drops to the next depth range. You don't need to see the bottom or own a single piece of electronics. The plants have already mapped it for you, in plain daylight, before you ever get near the water. 3 bands, moving out from the bank. Band 1 is emergent shallow growth, cattails or similar marsh plants, usually rooted in a foot or two of water over soft mud. Where this band ends matters more than where it begins, because the outer edge is typically close to where the water moves past easy wading depth. Band 2 sits deeper, bulrush, reeds, or lily pads, right where the bottom starts its first real drop toward open water, and it's often the single most productive band on the whole staircase, especially where it narrows tight against the bank. Band 3, visible only in clear, calm water, is submerged grass just beneath the surface, marking the last identifiable structure before the bottom opens into featureless deep water. If this kind of field-based reading is useful to you, a like helps more anglers find it. How wide each band runs changes the read completely, and it's the detail most anglers skip. A narrow band that transitions quickly into open water usually means a steep drop. The bottom falls away fast, and fish concentrate tightly along a short stretch of edge that rewards a precise cast over a wide one. A wide band that thins out gradually over a long stretch usually means a gentle slope instead, where fish spread out rather than stack in one place, and covering more water pays off more than trying to pinpoint a single spot. Which species you're actually after changes which part of the staircase matters most. And this is where the system stops being botany and starts being a decision. Bluegill and other panfish typically hold along Band 2 and the inner edge of Band 3, especially through the first half of the season, shifting slightly deeper into Band 3 as summer progresses. Bass tend to work the outer edge of Band 3, the submerged grass line, using it as an ambush position the same way they'd use any other hard structural break, often holding tighter to that edge on bright days than on overcast ones. Catfish are less tied to the bands themselves and relate more to what's sitting on the bottom nearby. The bank soil check coming up shortly is really their version of this system and matters more for them than the vegetation does. Time of day shifts where along the staircase the fish actually are, on top of which species you're targeting. In the first hour or two of light, fish often push up into Band 2 and the inner edge of Band 3, following baitfish into water that's warming fastest closest to shore. By the middle of the day, especially once the sun climbs high and the shallows heat up, most activity slides back out toward the Band 3 edge or beyond, where deeper water holds steadier temperature and more overhead cover. Late afternoon reverses the pattern again, pulling fish back toward the shallower bands as the light angle drops and the surface starts to cool, which means the same stretch of bank can be worth fishing twice in one day, morning and evening, for 2 different reasons. But the bands only tell you where the structure is. They mark the same depth changes whether it's 5 in the morning or 3 in the afternoon, whether the fish are actively feeding or holding tight and inactive somewhere along that same edge. They don't tell you which part of that structure is holding fish today, and that gap is exactly where most anglers who learn this system still get stuck. Closing it takes 3 more checks, and 2 real ponds later in this video show exactly how they play out. Birds and feeding sound answer that second question, and you only need 1 short pause on the bank to read them. Watch for a heron or similar wading bird returning to one specific stretch of a band edge. Across a few minutes of observation, That's today's activity confirming what the bands already suggested about the structure. Listen for a cluster of small, repeated splashes concentrated along one band, especially in the first or last hour of daylight, rather than a single, isolated splash out in open water, which is often just a fish jumping and rarely means much on its own. A quiet stretch with no birds and no sound isn't necessarily dead water. It just means today's activity hasn't shown itself yet. The vegetation tells you where the structure is every single day. Birds and sound tell you which part of it is actually working right now. Bank soil adds a final layer of confirmation, and it matters most exactly when two bands look nearly identical from a distance. A sandy bank usually continues as sand or fine gravel just offshore, the kind of bottom panfish and bass often use for bedding structure in season. A dark, soft, muddy bank usually means a soft organic bottom nearby, catfish water specifically, and the detail that matters most for that species. When the vegetation alone can't tell you which of two similar-looking spots is better, the soil behind them frequently will. The final confirmation is physical, not visual, and it takes only a few seconds. Before committing to a spot, run a long stick or pole out along the edge of the band you're targeting, feeling for exactly where the bottom drops away beneath the surface. A sharp resistance change close to the bank confirms a steep drop. A stick that has to travel further before finding any real change confirms a gradual slope instead, matching whatever the bandwidth already suggested, and turning an educated read into a known fact before a single cast goes in. This is where the system starts to fail, and knowing when matters as much as knowing how to read it in the first place. A bank that's been recently mowed, eroded, or exposed by a sudden drop in water level won't show its usual bands at all, even though the underwater structure beneath it hasn't changed. Invasive vegetation species, thick mats of duckweed or aggressive non-native reeds, for example, don't follow the same depth and light rules that native plants do, and can throw the whole reed off wherever they've taken over a shoreline. In algae-choked or heavily stained water, light simply doesn't penetrate the way it does in clear water, which changes where each plant type can survive, regardless of what the actual depth beneath it is. Recognizing when the reed doesn't apply is just as important as reading it correctly when it does. Timing affects how much you can trust the bands themselves, separate from how you trust the fish behavior riding on top of them. Early in the growing season, regrowth is often patchy and incomplete, making the bands harder to distinguish clearly. Lean harder on soil and bird activity during this window, rather than the vegetation alone. By the height of summer, once growth has fully established for the year, the bands are at their most stable, wide enough and dense enough to read from a distance without walking the whole bank. By late fall, dieback starts blurring the edges between zones again, the same way early spring does. The staircase reads most cleanly from late spring through late summer, in most freshwater ponds and lakes. Here's how the full system comes together on real water. A dark, muddy bank with a narrow band too. No birds visible on arrival. Wait 2 minutes rather than casting immediately, and a heron finally settles at one specific stretch of that narrow band, not the bank in general. A stick probe at that exact stretch confirms a sharp drop right where the heron is working, the resistance changing within a foot or two of the edge. Narrow band, muddy soil, a confirmed steep edge, and a bird holding one precise spot. Every signal points to the same conclusion. Fish stacked tight, likely panfish given the band position, at that one stretch specifically, not spread across the whole bank. A second pond, same system, a completely different answer. Sandy bank this time, wide gradual bands with no sharp transition anywhere along them, and no birds working the water at all during the observation window. The stick probe here has to travel several feet further out before finding any real depth change, confirming the gradual slope the bandwidth already suggested from shore. With bass more likely than panfish at this kind of outer grass edge structure, the target shifts to band 3's outer line, and the right approach becomes covering more water with a series of casts, rather than concentrating on one narrow stretch the way the first pond called for. Same method, 2 ponds, 2 entirely different decisions, because the system reads the water actually in front of you, not a fixed rule applied blindly everywhere. The field checklist. Read the bands first. Band 1 marks the waiting limit. Band 2 is usually the most productive. Band 3 marks the last structure before open water. Narrow band means target it precisely. Wide band means cover more water instead. Match species to position. Panfish toward band 2 and inner band 3. Bass along the outer grass edge. Catfish tied more to bank soil than to the plants themselves. Confirm with birds and sound for what's active today. Soil for a tiebreaker and a stick before you commit. Skip the reed entirely on disturbed banks, invasive growth, or stained water. Has a stretch of bank ever looked like nothing, right up until you worked out what it was actually telling you? Subscribe to Traditional Angling. Next time, we pick up where the bank ends.